Local stories, local people. We're taking you inside Western Mass news. It's the Even Better Western Mass podcast with Dave Madsen.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Even Better Western Mass podcast. Wherever you are, hope you're doing well. Hard to believe it is already the 1st of November. Now, this podcast drops on November the 2nd, a day before one of the most unusual election seasons in our history comes to an end, with the vote. The battle for the White House in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. It has been a race like no other. That's probably the understatement of the year. And it's also the focus of the podcast this week. My guest is Western New England University history professor John Baick. John and I talk about the campaign, early voting, its impact, and what to expect if the final vote between Donald Trump and Joe Biden turns out to be very close. John, thank you for being a guest on this week's edition of Even Better Western Mass. As we record this, we're just a few days away from the election like no other. Do you ever remember a campaign for president like the one we've seen in 2020?
I mean, not exactly personally. Certainly, I teach a lot about this, but I mean, just going backwards, there's a lot that happened this year that happened in 2016. I think a lot of people didn't pay as close attention in 2016 because it almost seemed like a foregone conclusion because the polls were pretty comfortable and the chance of the now president winning seemed so remote. But looking back, there were basically the same themes and the same ideas. And really, the president's trying to rerun his successful Cinderella-like campaign of 2016 with a lot of the same messages. So in that sense, it is certainly reminiscent of that. Going back further, and this is where I can't claim personal memory, certainly the 1968 campaign. And that was a year where I'll have to take this from my historical sources. I can't attest to this personally, but by all accounts, the actual violence and the actual protests in the streets far exceeded what was going on this year. What people saw this year was sort of hyper-focused, small, localized events. Now, if you were someone who had their business destroyed, there's very cold comfort in knowing that this wasn't a nationwide movement. But really, 1968 was far more violent, far more dangerous, far more unstable. And in that setting, it was Richard Nixon who effectively, he didn't coin it, but he popularized this idea of law and order, something that the Trump campaign has been trying to really focus on in the last several months. And certainly, Nixon ran the outsider candidacy in 1968. I'm against the establishment. I am against the status quo. You vote for me, you get an outsider, which President Trump did as candidate Trump in 2016. And what's so odd is that he's trying to do it again. He is effectively in 2020 running against the status quo. In a way, he's running against himself. He said, vote for me and we won't have the America that I have presided over the last 4 years. And this may seem inexplicable, but I think to his base, and perhaps we'll talk about this later, there's reasons to go along with him for that. There are people who support the president no matter what he does. He famously said back in 2016 that he could go out onto Fifth Avenue in front of Trump Tower and shoot people and he wouldn't lose support. He was kind of garbling the standard advice that a political consultant would give a candidate, but still, he had a point then and he has a point now. And I guess finally, before 2016 and 1968, I would go back to 1896. And in this point, I think we're pretty confident. No one listening to this podcast remembers 1896 particularly well. But I have been telling my students for decades, for as long as I've taught American history, that 1896 held the top rank as the most vicious election in American history. It was an election between a Republican, not exactly incumbent, it was in McKinley, and a Democratic insurgent, and that was William Jennings Bryan. And Bryan was calling for a dramatic remaking of the order. That's the year, and maybe some people will remember this from high school, remember this from college. That's the year where Bryan gave the Cross of Gold speech, electrified Democrats, electrified this group called the Populists, and he seemed to be headed, cruising towards victory. McKinley's response was to basically turn his party into the party of the wealthy, and to basically, he and his proxies outspent the Democrats 10-1. And it wasn't just the money, and it wasn't just the control over the media. It was a message so negative, so vile. We had never seen it before or since, but we have seen it this year. In 1896, McKinley and his proxies said, if you vote for the other guy, he will force you to convert to his religion. That America as we know it will come to an end. Don't believe anything he says. It's all just cover for his radical, socialist, and godless, and religious conversion. None of these messages made sense together, but you targeted people. You targeted people in Ohio. You targeted people in New York. You targeted people all across the country. That election seemed to me untouchable, that we would never come back to that again. 2016, we came close, especially with the calls to lock up an opponent, with demonizing various groups. But in 2020, we have gone over that line. In 2020, we have gone beyond that sort of gold standard of 1896 for sheer viciousness. It is kind of unbelievable. And win or lose, President Trump has made his mark on our political culture. And no matter who wins this election, I am willing to pronounce here that American democracy is broken. It's not dead. I mean, it's mostly dead, but it will need to be rebuilt, no matter who wins this. And to rebuild the trust of the American people over the next generation is going to be an incredible task. A President-elect Biden can't possibly do it in one or even two terms. And a President Trump, if reelected, I'm not sure he wants to remake it. I think he has a different notion of how democracy should work.
I always look back to the 2016 election, too. Not so much a vote against for Hillary Clinton or against Hillary Clinton, but more a vote for change. And that's something that I've often thought we've kind of lost in the whole thing, that I'm not so sure Trump was elected in 2016. It was change that was elected, and we really haven't seen much.
That's an excellent point. I was thinking about this, that Hillary Clinton was obviously not the incumbent in 2016, but it felt like she was. And she not only represented a continuity from 8 years of Obama, she represented, of course, a continuity of 8 years of Bill Clinton. So in a way, Trump was not just running as a non-politician, as an outsider. He was running up against 16 years of Democratic politics, 16 years of establishment politics, where he's trying to tell Americans, if you didn't like something about those years, if your job didn't get better, if your prospects didn't get better, if your health care didn't get better, vote for me. So it was a vote against Hillary Clinton as much it was a vote for Trump. Whereas this year we have the flip. Not that many people are truly voting for Joe Biden. The universal acclaim of his supporters seems to be, yep, he's a good guy, he's a good politician, he's a good public servant. But above all, this is a referendum on the president. It's a vote against Trump. And all the polls show this, that the president's enthusiasm levels are sky high among his smaller base. Biden's enthusiasm levels are lower. But when you ask them, what do you think about the president, then their negative feelings are sky high. So it's a vote for change again. A change to what is not clear. Biden is not saying we go back to Obama or go back to Clinton. In some respects, and some listeners will appreciate this one, I hope, this is a return to the New Deal. This is a return to a country divided and broken and on its knees, and looking to the government to do the right thing by its people. And I think this is what a Biden administration would have to deliver to begin to not just deal with the pandemic and the economy, but to rebuild trust. It's going to be a new deal.
You know, John, I look at this too, and I wonder, how did we get to this point? Part of me goes back to 1994 and battles between Gingrich and Bill Clinton. But I wonder times if it went back before. It's like both sides just don't get along. Doesn't seem like there's any room for compromise anymore.
I tell my students to think about someone like President Eisenhower. And perhaps some people know him as president, perhaps some people know him as the hero of D-Day. But President Eisenhower was a Republican who was also a liberal not by our modern sense, but by a liberal, but by the sense that President Roosevelt put into place. A liberal believes that the government has an active role to play. The government is not telling you what to do. It's doing what you want it to do. So the Eisenhower highway system, a gigantic number of tax dollars went into that. Yet Republicans and Democrats compromised over that. There were obviously differences between Republicans and Democrats, significant ones, but the points of common ground could be found and could be worked on. That common ground lasted through the 1960s. And if you want to look for a breaking point, to me, it's the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, above all, is about a fundamental reassessment of what America means and what the government is supposed to do. And you can draw a straight line from the civil rights movement to the Black Lives Matter movement of the present day, because the civil rights movement isn't over. It's just gone dormant. It has come back now. And for those people who support it, they see it as civil rights. And for those people who are opposed to it, they often see it in terms of anarchy, chaos, socialism, disruption. So in a way, we are still battling the 1960s out. And that's part of what the 2016 election was about as well. It was about a referendum of what the 60s meant. Now, your point about Gingrich was excellent. The way he weaponized politics, the way he turned it into something not just personal, but something corrosive, that has been the playbook for the Republican Party at the national, at the state level. You can look at the Supreme Courts, you can look at gerrymandering. Republicans have turned politics into war in such a way that has been corrosive. But that's also the playbook for a party whose demographics are turning against them. It's a way of trying to retrench their power for the future. But if you think about someone like Mitch McConnell, 10 years ago, Mitch McConnell's reputation is somebody who loves the Senate, loves its traditions, above all, values the collegiality of that body. And he is someone who has gone beyond what Newt Gingrich would have imagined in terms of weaponizing politics, making up things as he went along. McConnell may be responsible in the way that Gingrich was responsible for the House for savaging traditions in the Senate. It is possible that the U.S. Senate in the years to come will not recognize the body that we saw 10 or 20 years ago. And McConnell is that inflection point.
You know, and you talk about the civil rights movement and the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. And I mean, for those who go back far enough, remembering that at one point in time, the South was solid for Democrats. And that's exactly not the case anymore. But that Civil Rights Act was the turning point in all that.
Yeah, and the Democratic Party, this is where it gets complicated. The Democratic Party in 1896 became the party of the workers and became the party of the farmers, which basically describes a lot of the South at the time. But it was also the party of white supremacy. But then again, so was the Republican Party. They didn't care about white supremacy. The Republicans more and more become the party of the North as they become the party of wealth and business. And in some respects, the Republican Party almost becomes like the Union in the old Civil War. But neither Republicans or Democrats cared about blacks. And to be terribly honest, neither did President Roosevelt. He allowed some of his hallmark programs to be used for whites only. The GI Bill was effectively for whites only. Black veterans could not use their GI Bill benefits. The construction of the suburbs were based on the idea that only whites would live there, and you could have legal restrictions, legal segregation in suburbs in Massachusetts and New York and New Jersey, and Americans didn't notice and didn't care. The Democratic Party was associated primarily with the South and with northern cities. The Civil Rights Movement, what Lyndon Johnson, what Martin Luther King, which other people force, the Civil Rights Movement redefines the Democratic Party. President Trump likes to give an incomplete picture and say that the Republicans are the party of Lincoln, and they still were the party of Lincoln in the 1950s. I'm sure everyone knows who Jackie Robinson was. He was a Republican. But Jackie Robinson would not be a Republican today. He wouldn't recognize that party. The Democratic Party splits, and Lyndon Johnson actually says this after he signed the Civil Rights Act, and even more so after he signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I've just lost the South. The Democratic Party will no longer be the dominant party of the South, but it's the decision he makes in order to move forward as a nation. If you want to give a more modern example of this, President Obama understood that he hurt the Democratic Party when he pushed through health care. Mm-hmm. He could have simply focused on a jobs bill and infrastructure and made the Democratic Party much safer. But he chose to use the moment to push through health care, just as Lyndon Johnson chose the moment to push through civil rights. And I guess it's up to the judgment of history to see whether they made the right decision. They certainly both hurt their party.
So we get back to the 2020 election, and at the beginning of the year, we knew a little bit about the coronavirus, but do you think that's changed the tone of the 2020 campaign? Is that the issue this may all come down to?
I think it is basically 99%. And it's not that everyone cares about the coronavirus more than other issues. And you look at the opinion polls, for Democrats, the coronavirus is the top issue by far. For Republicans, it's not even a top 3 issue. However, the way I see it, it's because Democrats choose to focus on the pandemic and Republicans choose not to focus on it. They have to see it. They know it's there, but they decide through observation, through anecdote, or simply through faith. A lot of this election comes down not to democracy and not to objective thinking, but to faith. And for a lot of people, the idea that the coronavirus is as bad as scientists say it is just unthinkable. Because if it's that bad, it means their president has abandoned them. And they simply refuse to believe that. Just like a lot of people refuse to believe that a friend, an associate could be responsible for something, could be guilty of something, they're going to stick by them. It's by faith. And sometimes their faith is rewarded. It turns out that the accused is not guilty of something. And in the perspective of some, the president has done a magnificent job. In the perspective of most scientific experts, of most public health experts, he has done an abysmal job. But we are in a post-facts era. We are in a social media era where we have now proven conclusively that the internet does not make us smarter. The internet just makes us more tribal and more focused on faith rather than science, rather than facts. And for all those who thought that the information revolution would free up knowledge, they were all wrong. And so was I. I just expected that somehow access to information meant good, but it hasn't. The typical voter, the typical high school kid, they simply knew more. We knew more when you were a newscaster 5 years ago, when you were a newscaster 25 years ago, when you were a student writer, I'm not going to give the number of years or decades, when you were a student journalist, the average American was better informed. It's simply truth. And we didn't have the internet. And this information, this explosion of information has allowed us to become more irrational and more tribal and more based on faith. And I think that this applies to some extent to Biden supporters as well. I think some Biden supporters as well, it is an article of faith to them that Trump wants to let them die, wants to wipe them out. And at this point, I defy anyone to tell me what the president truly thinks, what he truly believes. I think he keeps his cards very close to the vest. For someone who goes all in all the time, and maybe we'll talk about odds and cards later, I would not want to play cards against him. You think you know his tells, and then he'll reverse it. When he says something like, people say or they say, that to me is a clear sign that he is misrepresenting the truth, that he is lying. But then there are other times where he actually might be sincere. It is hard to predict. I don't think anyone would have predicted that the president would, in the last few days of his campaign, and I'm not positive of this, but it sounds like to me that he would echo Jan Brady's Marsha, Marsha, Marsha with COVID, COVID, COVID. I am just stunned that he is doing that, much less dancing to the village people at his rallies. I don't know if the president who lived in New York for many years knows what that song is actually about. Maybe he does. I don't know if his supporters do. But him echoing the Brady Bunch and the village people, I wouldn't have expected this, not for the last week of the campaign.
Not any of us. Do you think without COVID-19, Trump would be cruising to victory?
Cruising to victory, no, but he certainly would have the advantages. We've already seen his willingness to use the apparatus of the presidency, of the executive branch, of the federal government. Something that I was talking about with students in the past couple of years, and something that largely fell on deaf ears because it's a complicated subject. The way you use the federal government, the way you use the Treasury, the way the Federal Reserve operates, these are supposed to respond to macroeconomic forces. So the way that the Bush administration and Obama administration tried to deal with the Great Recession, that followed the macroeconomic textbook. What President Trump has done with tax cuts and with federal stimulus and with basically intimidating the Federal Reserve, these were exactly the wrong things to do at the wrong time. They provided an artificial boost, but it means that right now, when we need it, we don't have all of the tools at our disposal. Our toolkit is a bit limited. I'm not saying that there are things that can't be done, but some of the easiest things to do have already been used up. The interest rates are basically too low to lower anymore unless we go into negative territory. The president was doing this in clear preparation for his reelection. So I don't know if he would be cruising to reelection, but I am pretty certain he'd be in a much better place. Then again, there have been probably half a dozen things over the last couple of months that would undo most presidential campaigns. So many revelations, so many shocks, yet these get lost. They get lost by the news cycle, but they also get lost because COVID is so much more important. So it's possible that something could have emerged from the woodwork and really been investigated and really been drilled down into. Suspect that we would be looking at an election where the president had a better than even chance of winning. Now, say 60-40, for example. 60-40 is still pretty nerve-wracking. 70-30 is still pretty nerve-wracking in some respects. That's what Hillary Clinton had. And now with Biden, we're talking 80-20, or the latest number I saw, to be precise, was 88-11, 8-1. Even that, 8-1, that is still something that could happen. That is still someone playing a hand of cards and you can hit the card you're looking for. It's still something where if you have, well, I'm not going to get up, but if you have a six-sided die, it's more, the odds are longer than rolling the six you want, but it's not much further either. I think that Trump would still have his work cut out in some respects. It would still be an interesting contest. And of course, without COVID, what you would have would be a lot more Democrats actually stumping and actually knocking on doors. The Democratic Party and all that enthusiasm of their supporters, they basically agreed, we are not going to do the regular things. We are going to socially distance. We're not going to hold rallies. I suspect that there are more people who are willing to volunteer to oppose the president than support him, but those who are opposing him are trying to play it safe. So that army of volunteers, that enthusiasm is missing from the Democratic side. I don't know what difference that would have made.
We talk about polling too. How much, and we hear so many polls, how much can we rely on polling?
I mean, the only poll that we can truly rely on is a 100% poll taken basically on election day. There's an old Stephen Wright joke that he has a map of the United States. It's a 1-to-1 ratio map, and he keeps it outside of his door. And the first time I heard that joke, I had to think about it, and I go, oh, I see. It's the whole country. That's his map. A poll that is large enough, that has a large enough sample size, is generally going to be pretty accurate if it's a reputable group. If a poll is run by a Democratic group, by a Republican group, it might be accurate, but it might also be designed to influence people's opinion. The national polls, I think, are pretty accurate. They may not reflect the final vote because there is a very aggressive voter suppression campaign being run right now. And that's something, a playbook that we saw in the 1960s with civil rights. It's something that we saw in other years. The fact that the post office has its worst delivery on time delivery records now, it's not an accident. When you appoint someone whose mandate is to slow down and eventually privatize the post office, the timing is not an accident. There's just no way you can call it that. When you have state after state, and Texas is the most egregious. There's one drop box in a county of 1,600 square miles. That's just a ridiculous concept. So the popular polls, there's going to be voter suppression that you have to add into it. But that being said, I bet the national polls are going to be pretty close to accurate. What we don't know are the state polls, and even more so, the county polls. So a state poll of Wisconsin the other day showed a big lead for Biden, but that's a poll done of the whole state. If you canvassed every county and you added those results together, it might be very different. I can't personally see Joe Biden winning Wisconsin by 17%. That just strikes me as being an aberrant poll. I could see him winning, but by that margin, that one seems out of whack. Yet the national polls, and a lot of the pollsters have been saying this, have been slightly tightening. We're talking from highs of 10, almost 11, down to 9, down to 8. But that's exactly what was predicted, because undecided voters this time are basically Trump voters who are not sure they'll vote for him again. Mm-hmm. In 2016, the undecideds basically broke, what was it, 4 or 5 to 1 for Trump. So really, the polls were accurate in 2016 as well. They just weren't quite accurate in a couple of states. Michigan, 10,000 votes. That's 2 votes per district, per precinct. And Wisconsin was 70,000 votes. Again, just a handful of votes per area. 80,000 votes decided the election out of over 100 million cast. So the polls were pretty accurate. I suspect they'll be pretty accurate again, but it's going to come down to Florida and Pennsylvania and Michigan. And just maybe we're talking about Arizona and Georgia and Texas. But if we're talking about those states, it's probably a large Biden victory if those start to come into the play. We also, by the way, might be talking about Nebraska and Maine, which are both states that split their electoral votes.
And that's the other part of this, too, is the Electoral College, where in many folks' mind, I know a lot of folks who live in Florida, they think in 2016 their vote really didn't count if they voted for Hillary Clinton with the winner take all.
Yeah. So the Electoral College, and I think, if nothing else, the last 4 years have taught Americans what the Electoral College is, that it's still this strange 18th century notion that basically takes the will of the people and waters it down. I'm not sure that the listeners realize that it was even more than that, because almost no one was allowed to vote at the time the Constitution was approved. In places like South Carolina, you basically had to be a wealthy slave owner to vote. And maybe Pennsylvania, it was one of the few states that's sort of a Quaker influence, where the average person, if he was white and if he was a man, could vote. But the Electoral College is designed as a break. It's designed as a conservative with a small c, not big C, a small c, deterrent to the will of the people, to the passions of the people. So if something happened in one part of the country, if one state overwhelmingly voted for one candidate, their will would be blunted by the more reasoned decisions of other states. So yeah, the rural states of America, the smaller states of America, have a vastly disproportionate influence. If the election simply came down to popular will, the Democrats would never lose. In fact, the Democrats would probably form two parties. There would be a left wing of the Democratic Party and a center wing. But because it comes down to electoral votes, because it comes down to being able to bank on Utah and North Dakota and South Dakota, there are not many votes, but you add them all up. It means that democracy is a strange beast. It comes down to President Trump saying that it's okay to drill off the coast of California, but it's not okay to drill off the coast of Florida. And then he added Georgia, as Georgia became more of a swing state. That's just nakedly partisan federal government putting their thumb on the scale. But that's how politics works with our swing state system now in Electoral College.
Sure. Let's go back for a minute to voter suppression. You know, it's one of those things we do hear of every now and then. I mean, it hasn't been a major issue here, but how widespread is it? I mean, is this something that we really should be concerned about?
Short answer, yes. Long answer, yes. Because this is something that Gingrich helped put into place, and it was done starting at the state level. This concept of gerrymandering, and we've been spoiled in Massachusetts, even though we invented gerrymandering. This was something that came from our state. We were a battleground of politics and political passions. I don't know if voters can appreciate this. I mean, I suppose we had some mildly scorched earth with Kennedy Markey this last time around, but Massachusetts used to be a hotbed of political activism. So you redraw districts in any way. These things really should be seen as unfair, undemocratic, but it's up to the courts. The conservative court we have had, it seems clear to them that they're going to leave it up to the states. The states can decide what they want. So it means that if you can win at the state level, if you can have your state legislators, then they can redraw maps in such a way as to, for example, put few Democrats in every district or all the Democrats in one district. These are just two very extreme examples. It's not something that Democrats have done as a party since the 19th century. The Democrats kind of invented and pioneered some of these tactics because the Republican Party is newer. But the Republican Party has gotten this down literally to a science. There is a science, there is an algorithm to this. Long before Amazon's algorithm, before Google's algorithm, the algorithm was how to divide states up. So right away when you gerrymander, you suppress votes. Then we've always had a system in which cities, it's harder to vote. There's more density. Rural areas have an advantage. The lines are shorter, and rural areas will insist that they have polling places that are geographically more spread out. So it's simply easier to vote in a rural area. It's harder to shop. It's harder to get to a local Walmart, but voting in most rural areas is very easy. And this is an example of voter suppression and voter encouragement. You'll see cities in states that lean Democratic make extra efforts to have early voting, and you'll have cities and states that don't lean Democratic where they close down the number of polling places. I don't know if you recall the Georgia primary, but the lines in Atlanta, a Democratic stronghold in a Republican state, the lines in Atlanta were terrifyingly long for a primary, which was uncontested among the Republicans. That was simply because they pulled, along with software problems, they pulled the number of polling places. And that's going to happen again because Republicans following Newt Gingrich have basically decided that politics is war. Governor DeSantis of Florida is the most egregious example of this. He has done everything he can to make it harder for some areas to vote. And this perhaps is unethical, immoral, but it's not illegal. Because if the Supreme Court says it's okay, and if you're the government, you're what you do is fine.
Yeah. Let's talk about you mentioned early voting and the fact early voting and mail-in voting, how big an impact that has. But well, I think as of today, I heard 72 million people have already voted.
Yeah, we have surpassed the early voting from 2016 as of yesterday. And I think we are heading to an election year not seen since the early 20th century in terms of percentage of the population. We are going to have a record turnout, which in part should concern Republicans because I think a lot of new voters are registering and voting, but should also concern Democrats because Republicans have been working very hard. They've been knocking on doors. They have not been distancing. They have been registering record numbers of voters in some areas. So the conventional wisdom right now says that early voting and the the registration data suggests that Democrats should be happy. But on election day, there is going to be a bigger number of voters in red states and red areas. There are going to be a lot more Trump supporters voting that day, which could, in a way, hurt them. Um, if there are 8 or 10 hour long lines and your support for President Trump is wavering, are you going to wait? And what I'm waiting to see happen on election day is if the governor of Texas or the governor of Florida suddenly announces we must hear the will of the people and we're going to keep ballots open for 10, 20, 30 extra hours. I wouldn't be at all surprised if you see long lines of Trump supporters and suddenly they reverse course on trying to limit voting and try to expand it. So expect election day to be a mess. It's going to be a mess all around the country. And even in Massachusetts, where there's not a whole lot of contested races, there certainly are some ballot questions. But even in Massachusetts, I think the enthusiasm on election day is going to carry over. We may not have the kind of lines we saw perhaps in 2008, but it's going to be pretty crowded, even though the majority of voters probably will have voted before then in Massachusetts. In fact, I'm certain of it. The majority of voters will have voted before election day in our state. You're still going to have big turnout that day.
True. And we've also heard the president, of course, questioning the validity of mail-in voting. Do you think that if it turns out to be very close between Biden and Trump, that this mail-in voting, that will be one of the factors in any possible legal challenge?
Yes, it's going to be a legal challenge regardless. They're already organizing. They basically have, it's the equivalent of dialing 911 on your cell phone and have your thumb hovering over the send button. There is a small army of Republican lawyers ready to file suit. And in fact, they've been filing suit in basically every swing state. They've been challenging that when ballots would be counted. They've been challenging one state recently said, well, if a poll worker looks at a signature on file and looks at a signature on the security mailing envelope, she can't decide on her own to overrule the ballot because, we think about our signatures, they change, and think about all the signatures we've done in the pandemic with a fingernail or something. The Trump administration is filing suit everywhere it can, not necessarily to win, but to establish the precedent, to establish the caseload of look at how many things we're talking about. And if you throw it to the Supreme Court, the 2000 election is very recent evidence of a court that made one of the most breathtakingly dishonest but not illegal decisions. They are the law. The Supreme Court in 2000 made one of the most ridiculous decisions. It was pretty much a political partisan decision, but who can challenge them? Who can question them? At that moment, Al Gore could have decided, well, let's see what happens. I'm going to challenge the Supreme Court. But that would have shredded American democracy as we know it. As it is now, the president has clearly indicated that he will shred democracy to win because he clearly seems to believe that he is more important than American democracy, that he is the one who, and I genuinely believe he thinks that he is more important than our democratic traditions, that therefore he's willing to do just about anything on that day and in the days beyond. The only chance we have of avoiding some legal challenges is a considerable Biden margin, which is possible. I'm just going to throw a number, say 50-50. 50-50 is basically Florida. If Florida, which counts its early votes early Unlike other states, which don't, other states wait till the polls close, and then they're going to have to count millions of ballots. I mean, I get paper cuts now opening a few pieces of mail. I can't imagine what it's going to be like there. The If Florida calls it, there's a very good chance that it's President-elect Biden. If we don't know about Florida, expect the legal challenges to begin. We just saw a decision the other day in a 4-4 court, well, 8 people, but it was a 5-3 decision over a voting case where Justice Kavanaugh said, we really need to have the election determined on election day, which is one of the more stunning things I've ever heard someone say. It's something that someone would say perhaps in a bar if the bars were still open, which I guess they shouldn't be. Personal opinion, not reflecting the views of this podcast. But I think the idea that a Supreme Court justice can say something that has nothing to do with reality, it reminds me of Supreme Court justices saying things about, well, we're going to get rid of the Voting Rights Act because racism is clearly not a problem anymore. And that was the Roberts Court just a few years back. If this case goes to a court that is now 6-3 and Amy Coney Barrett has been confirmed and she would hear these cases, she has made it pretty clear that she's not going to recuse herself. I could see one of the conservative justices saying, no, we can't destroy democracy. I could see Chief Justice Roberts saying, no, we can't do this. But I could see 5 Supreme Court justices siding with the president saying that all votes must stop. That is within the realm of possibility. It's not likely, but it's possible. So the election could be determined by Amy Coney Barrett. And if that's the case, what happens to any notion of democracy? What happens to any faith? Then we are going to see a repeat of 1968. It would be ugly. And there are other people who are pointing out that if Trump loses, his supporters are going to be not just despondent, but angry. We've seen his supporters carrying machine guns inside state houses. What happens if Trump loses in a way that they believe is contested? Then ugliness on that side too. The best chance we have for a peaceful transition is a comfortable Biden victory. I see the chance of a comfortable Trump victory, of Trump winning by 5%, of Trump winning Florida and Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. That's a 1 in 100. That is almost inconceivable, but still, I suppose, possible. But that would basically mean that something happens between now and election day that I don't want this to be a sound bite to be taken out of this and put on some QAnon site, but it'd be like, oh, so Joe Biden is Russian. I did not know that. Joe Biden was born in Russia, and Obama is a Kenyan, and they're working to pull down the republic. That would give Trump a 5-point margin of victory across the nation. Short of that, it's either a Biden comfortable win on election night or a very rocky week. This may not end. It possibly, even probably won't end on election night.
We do think back to 2000. Actually, I was just watching something about that the other night about how Florida went back and forth that night. First, it was declared for Gore, and then it went back to Bush, and it went back and forth all night long. But again, it came down to you talk about democracy, and I think back to 1960, where it was a close election, and Richard Nixon could have contested the Illinois vote, but instead, for the better of the country, decided not to. And Al Gore, the same thing in 2000.
Yeah. And it came down to democracy in 2000, but only because there was President Bush-elect eventually. His brother was the governor, and one of his campaign representatives was the Secretary of State. It came down to democracy because democracy can mean that sometimes people put a thumb on the scale, but you recognize that there's a scale. The Supreme Court, their decision in 2000, it's tricky to call that one democracy, yet it happens. These things happen in politics. And you're talking about 1960. You're talking about that's when the old Democratic machine had dead people voting for President Kennedy. And yeah, that definitely happened in 1960. But then again, the Republicans were engaged in that as well. The 1960s politics was considerably less regulated. And in those years, there would definitely be some votes that disappeared, votes that got lost. I'd say in this race, 99.9% of the ballots are going to be handled right. The ones that one worries about are the ones that aren't delivered. And there are going to be hundreds of thousands of ballots that will not be counted because they're going to arrive too late. And then there's going to be millions of ballots that aren't counted because they were done incorrectly. But that is not such an unusual thing. I actually listened to a podcast the other day where an elections expert realized that she did her primary ballot the wrong way. And she was so ashamed of this. Now, it was an uncontested race, but she votes. She votes. And when an expert gets it wrong, it's because there's no one uniform way of doing this. Do you remember the old baseball all-star game ballots? Do you remember those?
I do, yeah.
You punched those out?
Yep.
I think those for physical ballots and maybe the old Scantrons where you bubble them in with a number 2, that was the last time that voting was standardized. Everyone got those right. Every once in a while, you voted for the wrong guy. Maybe you were a straight Red Sox guy, but every once in a while, someone voted wrong. But those were things that we were tactile and used to. These absentee ballots are complicated. They are bizarrely complicated, and that's part of voter suppression. They are designed to make it harder to do that in some states. In other states, states like Colorado, it's kind of easy because it's designed to accommodate a spread out population who wants to participate. So it depends upon the state.
You know, we touched on this, John, that I think everything kind of points to how the president reacts to this. Is there a possibility that Trump could refuse to accept the election results?
Yes. And that possibility comes along with challenges. If it was President Trump in Richard Nixon's loafers in 1960, if it was President Trump in Al Gore's loafers in 1960, a lot of our candidates wear loafers. He would definitely have made a fuss. He definitely would have gone beyond just saying, okay, for the good of the republic, Richard Nixon and Al Gore both, and they had grounds for challenging, but they both stepped down. If President Trump has any glimmer of a possibility, he is going to contest this. That's why it really comes down to voting that day. And it comes down to really the national numbers. If there is a national overwhelming victory for Biden by popular vote and some tiny contested votes, it undermines President Trump's claims because at a certain point, he needs to have members of his party on his side. He needs to have some support. But if it's basically Trump saying, look, it's close nationally, it's close in every state, I can see Mitch McConnell going along with this. I could see members of the Republican Party, certainly Governor DeSantis. Governor DeSantis would not be governor without Donald Trump. There are several governors and senators and congressmen who owe their political lives to him, and they'll go down with his ship or ride with him to the bitter end. So, yeah, it's a real possibility. And it's weird to be talking about this because this is not one of the scenarios people usually consider. We may as well consider, is it possible that the ship from either War of the Worlds, which would be bad, or The Day the Earth Stood Still, which would be scary, but then okay, if those ships land? I think those probably are less likely, but I guess we should discuss them as all possibilities because, yes, we are facing the very real possibility. And the president hasn't been shy about this. Not once has he said, I will accept the results, because he said that the only results he would accept would be his victory, because the only way he could lose is if there are fraudulent votes. So he has laid the groundwork for this. But he did this in 2016 as well. In 2016, heading into the last week, the polls were tightening, but Hillary Clinton still had that 70% chance of winning. Trump was on the record over and over. We're going to win this. The only way we lose is if there are fraudulent votes. People weren't paying attention to him back then. They thought he was simply laying the claim for being a thorn in Hillary Clinton's side. Now we're talking about someone who would refuse to leave the White House.
It is an interesting time, John. I think we're almost nearing the end of our time here on Zoom. Do you have a prediction for Tuesday?
No, I'm going to be bold and say that I think it's going to be the Los Angeles Dodgers and the Los Angeles Lakers. And yes, this is not really a prediction, but I'm a historian. Uh, I do predict that the shakedown from this, the repercussions from this, the analysis from this, the podcast from this will last years. This is going to be an election for the ages, an election to study, and it's going to be a watershed. It's going to be one of these inflection points where going forward, we're going to go either and continue in the direction we are going in now, or we're going to make not a 180, I don't want to be that dramatic, or we're going to make a 90-degree turn. But this is going to be a very, very dramatic election. And back in 2000, I still remember students saying, it doesn't matter. Bush, Gore, they're all the same. I'm voting for Nader. I don't want to throw away my vote. No one really could have anticipated 9/11 and the war in Iraq and the war on terror and the transformation of the world. I think everybody knows now that we are either voting for a continuation of the leadership of Donald Trump or for a sharp turn away from that. And I think all around the country and all around the planet, people see this as a moment to hold their breath. I can't think of a moment like this, honestly, since the Cuban Missile Crisis, where people around the world looked to Washington, D.C. and realized their fate rested in what happened there. What happens in the next week shapes the fortunes of the planet, period.
I think we should revisit this after the election. Goodness knows how far after the election, but it'll be interesting to get your assessment on that and where historically we're headed with this.
Okay. Well, it was a pleasure talking to you again. I miss doing this in the studio. We're talking from different studios, but studios are studios, so I appreciate it.
Studios are and by the way, congratulations on your world champion Los Angeles Dodgers. I know you're a Dodger fan.
Yes. And the fact that the Dodgers won and the Red Sox didn't, there should be no bitterness. It's all about Mookie Betts, and there should be no grief that the greatest Red Sox in a generation is now a Dodger. I mean, this is not something what we need to hash about. Perhaps there could be a podcast there.
Well, the fact, too, that he was very much responsible for that win last night just had salt to the wound for Red Sox fans, but it was good to see him win.
And he's a good guy, and I think this is a model for politics. If we can go back to a time, think back to Eisenhower versus Adlai Stevenson, people worked really hard for their candidate, and they woke up the next day and their person lost. That's okay. You still respect the other side. For Red Sox fans, it's been agonizing. You've only won 4 rings in the last generation. It's just terrible. I've seen so many people talking about this. Good for Mookie Betts. I would look forward to a political environment in which your person loses. Good for the winner. Someday we can have a return to that. I think. I hope.
My thanks to John Baick for taking the time to be with me for this week's edition of the Even Better Western Mass podcast. Thanks for watching or listening. Wherever you are, stay safe, stay well, and if you can, join me next week.